So obviously when we were doing fiction, imagery was still a really important part of fiction as well, but in a totally different way. I mean, we talked about imagery in a way, but through things like symbolism and through things like setting. But in poetry, excuse me, in poetry, imagery has its own whole discussion, because authors, poets, and songwriters will often very specifically use pictures through words to make points and to layer on different types of meaning as they build it for the listener or the reader. So it's the poem's link to the senses. So in poetry, sensory perception is extremely important. So imagery refers to words that trigger your imagination to recall and recombine images. So that's a really important piece of poetry that's different than when we're reading fiction. So words that trigger your imagination. So any kind of words that make you start thinking about something specific, and not just that trigger your imagination, because that by itself may not be that difficult of a trick. But the second part is not just to recall it, but to recombine images. That's the hard part. That's where you start finding the mastery of poets and songwriters, is when they can alter how you might have thought about these images and these ideas, that they start layering together for you going forward. That's where you really figure out how well somebody can write songs and write poetry. So memories are mental pictures of sights, sounds, taste, smell, sensation of touch, and emotion. So we're talking about the full range of human senses is connected to imagery. So in some ways, you're recreating the work in your own way through the controlled stimulation produced by the writer's words. In this way, poetry is still sometimes called interactive, because which seems like a weird thing, since a lot of the poetry we're reading is written by people who've been dead for 100 years or more. So it's like, how could it be interactive? How can you interact with a person that's, dust? Well, it's interactive, not like, a touch screen is interactive. It's interactive in a different way, because it's individualized in some way. Your experience with poetry, your experience with a song may be different than my experience with a song, or the person next to you's experience with a song or a poem. So for one person, it may be deep, or it may be sad, or it may be dark. And for another person, it may be elating, it may be happy, it may be whatever. So it all depends on what we bring with us, right? You work your own way through the controlled stimulation produced by the writer's words. So the writer tries to control the situation as much as they can. They're not here anymore. Once the words hit the page and they let it go, they don't have that control anymore. So they have to be as controlled as possible before they let them go out into the world, so to speak. So they are going to pick their wording carefully. They're going to pick their images carefully, because they're trying to elicit a very specific response from their readers and from their listeners. So there's a lot of guesswork in there, but each one of us brings our own experiences to the table. So take the word dog, for instance. So I put the word dog up here, right? You see this word, dog, and notice that there's no picture of a dog, right? I could have put a picture of a dog, obviously. It's a slide set. I could have put anything I wanted, but I didn't. And the reason I didn't is because, having put the word dog and me having said the word dog like 5 times now, I was hoping that it would make you think of a dog, or that even if you're not consciously thinking of a dog, the picture of a dog has popped into your head. And the reason this week why I have the picture of the polar bear drinking the Coca-Cola on the front is there was like this old saying where it's like, whatever you do, don't think of a polar bear sitting on an ice cap. You can't help it. As soon as somebody says it, you're going to think about it. It's pictured, it's in your head. It's that quick that we respond, and we are very visual creatures, and boom, it's in your head. Even if your life depended on you not picturing it, well, too bad, because it's already there. The same thing happens with dog. I say dog, I tell you, whatever you do, don't picture a dog, and you can't help it. You're going to picture a dog. So some of you may have pictured a big dog. Some of you may have pictured a little dog or a medium dog. Some of your dog pictures in your head are pleasant pictures and pleasant memories. Some of yours are not. Some of yours are brand new and shiny because you just looked at your dog today, or your dog is sitting next to you right now while you're looking at this. Some of you have a vague, fuzzy memory of a dog because you haven't been around one in a long time, or you're missing a dog that you had in years, or you hate dogs and you don't want to be around dogs, or a dog bit you when you were little and you're scared of dogs. So we're all going to have a different experience, and we're all going to have a different picture in our head. So the writers never know what that's going to be. So they take something that's going to be across the board, which is we're all going to picture a dog, not knowing what that's going to be exactly, except that it will be a dog. And then they want to layer things on top of it and start getting us to associate the word dog with something else. And often in poetry and in songs, those images are usually connected to other senses and other emotions and other feelings. So we'll kind of look at that, an example of that in just a second. So in studying imagery, one of the things that we try to figure out, one of the things we try to comprehend and understand and explain is our own individual imaginative reconstruction of the pictures and impressions evoked by the work's images. In other words, why did I see the word dog and feel happy? Why did I see the word dog and feel upset? Like for me personally, because I am a dog person and I love dogs, whenever I'm having a bad day and my husband knows I'm having a bad day, he will just send me a picture on my iPhone of this little basket of puppies, right? And I always have this very positive, happy, warm, fuzzy reaction to it. So I could sit there and, ask myself, why do I feel that way? Why does it make me feel this way? There's all sorts of things you can try to pull apart about it. So in poetry and in songs, when they're trying to get us to think about certain images and they try to elicit these images in our minds, why do we react this way? Why did we put this picture of a dog in our head? Why did we remember that dog that bit us when we were 5? Why did I think of, the dog that I had 2 years ago, even though I have a dog right now? So, I mean, we look at why did we think of certain things over others, and why did we react in a certain way? That's how we study imagery, and how much of that is controlled by the writer versus how much of it is controlled by us as the reader or the listener. So relationships of imagery to ideas and attitudes. Images do more than create an impression, right? So it's not just about creating an impression of happy, sad, good, bad, whatever. By authenticating effects of the vision and perception underlying them, they give you new ways of seeing the world. So if I read that really fast, it probably sounds like total gibberish. But what it means is, if you read it and whatever the author is saying, whatever the singer is saying, if you can get behind what they're saying, if you could start to feel what they felt, if they're upset about something that happened to somebody, they're singing a song about lost love, and you feel bad for them because you're listening to this song about lost love. And you wish that they didn't lose that person, and you feel bad for them. You're kind of buying into how they felt, okay? And you're putting it on yourself. So it gives you a new way of seeing the world, right? It gives you, even if you haven't lost somebody, it gives you a moment to kind of walk in their shoes or to kind of see things from their perspective. And that gives you a new perspective, right? So it's more than just having an impression. Imagery can be very powerful because it can have you see the world differently, even if it's just for a minute, through a poem, through a song. And I think music does that a lot for us. So here's an example of how this might work in a poem form. This is from Shakespeare Sonnet 116, which I did not have you guys read. It's a good poem if you want to go look it up. Sonnet 116, which is often also referred to as "Let me not to the marriage of true minds," B and then P and B. So it's a good poem. It's often quoted. It's one of his pretty famous ones. So in this poem, in this part that I pulled here, I pulled this part specifically because it's very laden with the idea that we were just talking about imagery, and imagery being used to create a new perception in the reader. So in this particular one, Shakespeare is trying to explain what he thinks love is to the reader, and essentially wants the reader to see love the way he does, even if it's just for a moment. So here he says, we'll read through it and then we'll talk about it. Love is an ever fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. So we have all sorts of imagery in here. So let's look at the first line. It says, love is an ever fixed mark. So you know what a fixed mark is, right? An ever fixed mark means some kind of mark that is permanent. Think of the best Sharpie in the entire world. You're going to make a mark with that Sharpie pen, and it is never, ever, 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 ever going away. In a billion years, that Sharpie mark is going to be still there, okay? So he is saying love is an ever fixed mark. It is permanent. It is never, ever moving or going away. It cannot be removed. It cannot be rubbed off. It cannot be washed away. It is always there. You can always see it. You can always find it. So this has this idea of permanence. He could have just said love is permanent, but you know, that feels like, okay, love is permanent. We get it. But it didn't give us a visual, right? So instead of just saying, hey, love is permanent, nah, he says love is an ever fixed mark. It's still the idea that love is permanent, but now he's giving us something very visual to understand it by. And in this case, it's something to see. The next line says that looks on tempests and is never shaken. So a tempest is a storm, usually referred to as a big storm, a great storm. So he's saying that love looks on tempests and is never shaken. So it can stand in front of the biggest storm and has no fear. So it is without fear, it is fearless, it is courageous, it is full of strength, and it is a rock standing there in front of this great storm, right? So he could have just said love has strength, love has no fear, whatever. But instead, he wanted to give us some kind of imagery here. It looks on tempest and is never shaken. It will just stand right up to it. And then he's going to give us another layer. So these are layers of how he wants us to understand what love is. He says, it is the star to every wandering bark. So a wandering bark, he means ship. Okay, I know that's not what we call them now, but a wandering bark is ship. So it is the star to every wandering bark. So now we have GPS, but back in the days of Shakespeare, they didn't have Siri. They didn't have any GPS and fancy stuff out in on the ships and stuff. They had to steer by mapping the stars, right? So to a sailor on a ship, the stars were their guiding light, right? The stars were always there. They could always count on them. They were forever, and they guided them home. They guided them to safety. They could always count on them to bring them back. So he's saying love is our guiding light. Love is what brings us back to where we need to be. But instead of just saying that, he wanted to give us this imagery of love as a star to every wandering bark. Love as a star to the ships in the night that could be lost. If you're lost, you can find your way. Love will help you find that way. The last one said, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. Because it's impossible to measure love, right? It's not something that you can walk up to with a measuring cup. Even though we have all this imagery for love, it is not something that can actually be measured. But yet there's the paradox that we are always trying to measure it. We have a lot of language in English where we're constantly trying to do just this, right? How much do you love me? He loves me so much. She doesn't love you very much, right? I love you a lot, right? So we're always trying to have this idea of a little bit, a lot. I love you more than anything in the whole world. You know, if only you loved me more. There's always this idea of amount of love. Yet the truth is, how much in the worth of it and what it means from one to another, it can't really truly be measured that way, but we're always trying. Okay, so it's just too big, it's immense, it's beyond the ability to measure, because the idea of it is beyond that. So 4 little tiny lines, but a huge amount of depth and imagery for Shakespeare to get across to us his idea of what love is, or what it could be. And if just for a moment, trying to get us to see what love is through his eyes. It's a nice sentiment, right? Love is an ever-fixed mark that looks on tempests and is never shaken. It is the star to every wandering bark, whose worth's unknown, although his height be taken. So it's a nice idea. Even if I flip to the next screen and you shake it off and you're like, psh, whatever, love, blah. All right? But just for a moment, you listened, you looked at it, and you had a moment of somebody else's perception. That's what poetry does. That's what songs do. That's the point. So relationship of imagery to ideas and attitudes. It puts an image in your mind that has its own ideas attached to it so that they have more impact and sway on you, which is what just happened, right? An image in your mind that has its own ideas attached to it. So an image in your mind like a tempest, an image in your mind like an ever-fixed mark, an image in your mind like a star in the night, right? And it now has its own ideas attached to it because they're all representing love, what love is in that poem. So now there's a different impact. There's a different idea attached to a star than before you read this poem. Also, when you form mental pictures and impressions from the poet's images, you respond with appropriate attitudes and feelings. He wants you to be lost in it. He wants you to have specific feelings about it. That control of your attitude, the reader's tone, the reader's response is how you know if they're a good songwriter or a good poet or not. So an author's use of imagery comprises one of the strongest means by which writers reinforce ideas. This goes back to this idea of packing, right? Remember our whole packing conversation. Poets have very little space. They don't get an entire book to write out all their stuff. They have this little space to write their song in. They got their 3 to 5 minutes. Or if it's a poet, they have their little, couplets in sonnet space, so they're 14 lines or whatever. So in this little space that they have to pack as much meaning to as possible, imagery is an excellent way to layer, right? Layering is the best way to save space. It gives authors influence and control over attitude of the reader, even if it's just for a moment. So we're going to talk about the types of imagery, and this is directly related to your homework that you're going to do this week. And hopefully it will be kind of fun. I tried to make it something kind of interesting related to this. So we're talking about the senses, right? The types of imagery are tied specifically to the senses. So the first type of imagery is visual. And just like it sounds, visual is the language of sight. Human beings are very visual. It's the most significant of our senses because it's the key to remembrances of other sense impressions. What that means is visual imagery oddly ties together all of our other senses. It's why it's so awful when people lose their sight. It's why it's difficult for people when they lose their sight, because it ties together all of their other senses. So when you see something, I mean, obviously it's visual, but think about when you hear something. When you hear a train horn, usually the first thing that happens is somewhere in your mind, you picture a train, right? When you smell bananas, you're going to probably picture bananas. When you taste watermelon, you may picture watermelon. Or when you're trying to decide what the taste is in your mouth, your mind will flip through different possibilities until it comes on the right one. And visually, you try to match what the taste is in your mouth. When you play those weird games like when you're a kid, when you would be blindfolded, and they usually were like Halloween, like little kid haunted house things, where they're like, you can't see, put your hand in this bowl, put your hand in that bowl. One was like spaghetti and one was Jello, and they're like, ooh, brains, worms, weird stuff like that. You don't know what you're touching, and when you can't see it, it could freak you out because it's very difficult to tell what it is when it's disconnected from your vision. So your mind and your vision and your touch are very connected, so it's hard to disconnect them that way. So our mind is going through visual possibilities while you're touching something. So it's kind of weird. It's how we put all of our things together. Vision is heavily key to our memories, right? Our remembrances and our impressions, even though feeling is a little bit stuck with that as well. And your sense of smell could also trigger memories, obviously, and taste. But vision is the biggest one. It's why it is the most widely used of the literary imagery. Auditory is the language of sound. So auditory images trigger our experiences with sound. So think about certain sounds. They often immediately bring to the front some kind of image or scene for you, even specific emotions. Like I was just saying about the train. Auditory imagery is also something that they're working heavily with in PTSD counseling right now, because they find that auditory imagery is a big trigger for trauma, right? Because it can trigger experiences and bring visual and even tactile and emotional experiences to the forefront for people with PTSD. So auditory can be a big trigger for things. So it's still ingrained in there. It's not any less important than visual imagery, but it's still up there. So it can have emotions tied to it as well as scenes. So some of the other ones would be olfactory, which is your sense of smell, right? That's probably one of some of the lesser ones, but if any of you have like a heightened sense of smell, my husband jokes that I have a heightened sense of smell because I have extremely poor eyesight. So he says that's my superpower, is my sense of smell. If that's true, then I've been ripped off, because that is a terrible, terrible superpower. I do not want to smell stuff like that well. It's not a good thing. But it can be a trigger. If you have a really heightened sense of smell, you can tell a lot about an area or a person or a place based on smell. And it also triggers a lot of memories, right? If any of you ever played with Play-Doh when you were little, I bet if I opened a can of Play-Doh in front of you right now, that it would probably trigger for a lot of you a visual memory of playing with Play-Doh when you were younger. Mainly because Play-Doh has a very, very distinctive smell about it. Every time I smell liverwurst, it makes me think of being a little kid and I didn't get to go on a field trip because it rained. And that's because that particular day, even though I was only maybe 5 or 6 years old, my mom packed me a liverwurst sandwich and we had to eat it in the gymnasium at school because we didn't get to go on the field trip. And I'll never forget that, only because of the smell of the liverwurst sandwich, which I do not eat liverwurst sandwiches anymore. Yuck. But I did at the time. That's what she packed me. I don't know. So it's just one of those weird smell related memories. So we have some of those that they'll remind you of certain things. Gustatory is your sense of taste. So there may be certain tastes that make you think of certain things, and certain tastes that remind you of specific things, kind of like right now I'm drinking pumpkin spice coffee, and I don't want to say you can only get it during this time of year, because you actually can buy it on Amazon at any time of year, but it's usually only in like the stores at this time of year. I only buy it at this time of year though because it reminds me of this time of year, right? It's a fall taste. So anytime I taste pumpkin, it makes me think of fall. So I assume that that's why they only sell it during fall. I don't know. I could be wrong. But there are taste-related memory pieces also. Tactile is our sense of touch. Not as much written about. Not uncommon in love poetry though, right? Her hair was silky smooth and her lips were like velvet, or those are all tactile, like a sense of touch. So these are all different types of imagery that you may read inside of a poem. So it's something that you're going to work with for this week's stuff. So here's the last set, which is kinetic and kinesthetic. Now, it's weird that they're separate because it's actually the same thing. Kinetic, they both kinetic and kinesthetic fit under the umbrella of the word kinetic, because they're both of these words actually mean motion and activity. So it's a type of imagery that means something in motion, okay? Kinetic and kinesthetic. The difference between them, the only difference between them is that kinesthetic, the longer word, specifically means human or animal movement, okay? So if I were talking about a rubber ball bouncing across the room, it could be kinetic, it's kinetic imagery, but it can't be kinesthetic because it's not a living thing. It's not a human or an animal movement. A rubber ball is just an inanimate object. So it can only be kinetic imagery. Now, if I said it was a rabbit hopping across the lawn, that's kinesthetic because it's an animal movement, but it's also still kinetic because it's overall movement. So it's kind of weird. It's kind of weird that they, it just means kinetic means any kind of movement at all. Kinesthetic very specifically means human or animal. The easiest way to think about this is think about kinetic as silverware and kinesthetic very specifically as a spoon, right? Kinetic means all movement. Kinesthetic is just human or animal movement. I don't know if that helped, but there you go. So that's another type of imagery. So the point of the window is imagery. Poets and songwriters help use imagery to just give us different ways to look out the glass, right? I mean, without this, we could go outside and look at this for ourselves, but each different way that we look out each pane of glass, that gives us a different perception of what's on the other side. Maybe this piece of glass is a different color. Maybe this piece of glass is beveled. But whatever it is, we're only getting a specific picture at a time that's shown to us by the author. And so it just gives us a moment to perceive it the way that the author intended to at that moment. So it's just a new perspective.